Friends, listeners, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us again. We've got another podcast session, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest, who is Charles Porteous, and he is the president and founder of Seefeld Group. Charles, big welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Lovely. Now, Charles, like we do with all of our guests, if you'd be so kind, just give us a little bit of background of what you do, why you founded Seefeld, and what Seefeld actually does for its customer base.
Sure. Well, Seefeld Group is what we call a voice of the customer consultancy. And really our role is to better align business decision-making with what customers actually think and want. And so in doing so, we enable our customers to find revenue opportunities and to manage risk. In other words, make better decisions. Yep. So the business was founded, now well over 10 years ago. The time goes by quickly, but and our really was based on the premise that what we saw was that in the most part, particularly in aviation, but in other B2B sectors, a lot of the techniques and approaches that are used successfully in other industries hadn't been applied to business aviation, and again, to us particular B2B, high value, high service B2B industries. And we thought by measuring the voice of the customer in a scientific, objective, and rigorous manner, we can actually help our clients and businesses really advance their marketing and their business development and to be more successful over time.
Okay, beautiful. Now some of the information that I've picked up focuses on strengthening customer satisfaction and loyalty. Okay, and interesting by listening. Okay.
Yes.
And there's an awful lot of organizations and companies that need to do that, because sometimes they tend to listen to their own voices internally and they base that on what's been done in the past. And this is now a totally different landscape as we're moving forward. So we'll come to that shortly, but it's building brand equity and increasing the product appeal by addressing real customer needs.
Yeah.
So we're listening to the customer. Now it's customer needs. And then lastly is leveraging the voice of the customer and reducing business risk and helping the customer make better decisions.
Yes.
Now, in sport, and especially in football, that would be a beautiful hat trick if it was able to be scored in that order. Now, on those 3 points, how do you actually show or explain to an organization how this can benefit them? And especially now, obviously not excluding the pandemic and what people have learned from it and the effect it's had and the worries and cash flow and margin matters issues. How do you convince organizations moving forward that these are the right tripartite of approaches that are necessary?
Well, I think to a certain degree, you've already said it yourself in your introduction. Basically, what we often see is that businesses, whether it be during the pandemic or just in general, as needs evolve, as trends evolve, as the competition increases, what you actually see is that businesses struggle to actually make decisions because to a certain degree they're paralyzed by figuring out, well, what is the actual situation? And by not being able to agree amongst themselves what the actual situation is and what customers actually really want, it actually slows them down. So in many ways, what we're doing is gathering the information, putting it out there for them, for the management, and facilitating them to use that information to actually either rectify a problem or take advantage of an opportunity. And sometimes the two are intertwined. So really the real added value of this is really around providing clarity. And with clarity, you can move forward.
100%. Yeah. I've got a little say myself that you need clarity, then competence, then compliance, then controls, and then you're in a pretty good shape if you're looking down from the heights of dizzy management. Now, taking the listening point of view.
Yeah.
Okay. And the word listening is obvious, and everybody tells us all, from when we're in school, and that's why God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. You listen twice as much, etc. But under pressure, people tend to let the mouth go, and they don't listen or stop and think enough. Now, how do you actually push that across so that people start to accept that they need to listen to the customer's needs?
Well, usually often what happens is, and we see this a lot with our customers, is that they obviously there has to be an issue or a pain point, but usually the pain point is the symptom, not the root cause. So you'll
Yeah.
often hear a situation saying, well, you know what, our we don't feel we're getting as much coverage in the media, for example, or we find, you know what, our we're not growing in market share as much as we would like. We need to advertise more or communicate more. And that may be the case, but what you actually find is that underneath, lurking behind that, are actually the real root problems, that what you're actually selling is not as relevant to customers as it used to be,
Yeah.
or that there's kind of a momentum of customers historically working with a provider, but generally not satisfied. And then they reach a tipping point where something finally pushes them away. Or you're in a situation, which I often talk a lot about, where you're actually you as a business, you're all of a sudden in a commoditized situation. So even in aviation, which is a high valued service, you actually a lot of companies end up being in a situation that the customers can't tell one provider from the other.
Yeah.
And as a result, they're very vulnerable to being undercut by price or by other factors such as personal relationships and you're in a situation where your problem is much more fundamental than you initially realize.
No, I agree with that. And also sometimes when organizations get a little bit complacent because they've got too much market share, or they've been doing it for so long and they've had long-term contracts, and they don't actually pay attention to what's happening or what the customer is perceiving as being either a decline or a challenge.
That is so true. And I mean, so many times you see, and you know, you've interviewed other people along the way. My colleague Jane, Jane Stanbury, who's a lovely person and a real expert, is that often companies mix up with presenting why their customers should work with them with communicating about their own success. So they get caught up talking about their success and not why customers should do business with them. And this is a problem that a lot of B2B businesses face. And a lot of times we help dissect that and bring them back to the basics about what are you selling, why should customers buy from us, and why are we better than the competition?
I think I've actually made a note of that. That's a great point, actually. That, you know, when you talk to organisations and you talk to a senior management team and you say, right, you know, we need to review, we need to do a health check, a gap analysis. They say, no, we've been doing this for 25 years and we've got X percentage of the market. And that's exactly right. And then all of a sudden, you see the same group of people subject to what might happen. And it's almost like you've been hit by an avalanche and they don't know what to do then.
Absolutely. And usually when you're hit by the avalanche, there may even become a time where it's too late. You know, one thing I always say to people, I mean, if the house is completely on fire and about to burn down, probably the voice of the customer isn't going to help them that much. But if the fire is starting to brew, we can actually provide information to help them solve the problem before the situation gets out of control. So, I mean, we can help customers at any point along the way. But I mean, I always advise people, it's much better to put in place the tools, identify the early warning systems, like a blood test, if you will, before the problem gets to crisis situation where it's very hard to react. And so we very much have the philosophy with the voice of the customer to use these tools to be proactive, to identify things before they happen or start to see trends as they evolve so you can control the situation. You know, if you're able to control the message yourself rather than have others formulate it for you, you're always ahead. And this is so much about what these voice of the customer tools and approach is all about, is about identifying issues and needs before others do it for you.
Exactly. So now, as a result of the pandemic, and obviously this has turned everything upside down and turned everything on its head. So, you know, this now focus on bring back better, giving people the chance to get rid of the legacy of waste, change the communication, focus on digitization, training, succession, crisis, etc. All those areas. So to bring back better, people have got to have a new outlook as well. So now you've been a professional marketeer for what, more than 25 years, you know. So the aviation connection, have you had that throughout that whole period, or is that an area that you've got into because you see a real need for people to address these particular skills in a better way?
Well, it's probably a bit of a combination of the two. I mean, I've been a marketer now it's almost getting closer to 30 years. And I actually got my start in consumer products marketing
Okay.
And to be politically incorrect, it was the tobacco industry.
Oh,
And
yep.
and one of the things I learned about in the tobacco, and I don't smoke, but I learned about the tobacco industry is with all the restrictions in communication and advertising, the way to get ahead was to really understand the customer needs. And I also want to be clear that it wasn't about understanding needs to get people to start smoking, but it was more about getting people to switch brands. And so if you had a very good, rigorous, long-term understanding about what preferences were over time, you could actually do things to actually increase your market share. And I always loved aviation, and I always loved, and I'm also, if you will, not a rebel, but I'm a person who loves to bring things that work in one place to bring it somewhere else, to
Yeah.
make it to make another industry better. And aviation, and particularly business aviation, was an industry 25 years ago, 20 years ago, that was growing really rapidly, but which had very few kind of professional approaches in order to run the marketing, make decisions around marketing. And at the time, I had the opportunity to work at Bombardier to bring some of those tools to Bombardier. And I like to think, although certainly not by myself at any means, but some of the tools that we had brought, that I had brought and learned from the tobacco perspective and the consumer products perspective, were put in place that allowed the company to find its market needs better, point in a direction, and rally the company towards better building its brands. And I saw that was done internally at Bombardier, and then ultimately I saw it could ultimately be done elsewhere across business aviation, as the rest of the industry itself realized it had to take a more professional approach to its marketing and business development.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. And now, so now with business aviation, private aviation, there's been huge changes, since 2008 up until pre-COVID,
Yeah.
and obviously dramatically changed now in 2020.
Yeah.
Now, as far as how you advise your clients on the challenging environment coming forward, and also benefiting from what's happened within 2020, because there's been a lot more focus on hygiene and touch points. And
Yeah.
obviously private aviation caters for everybody's fears, which are growing more so now, I think, than they were at the beginning, because there's an awful reality there. So until the vaccines start to kick in and better testing, there's going to be so many changes coming up, but people are still going to need to travel.
Absolutely, and they want to travel. I think the big thing is I personally don't have the direct answer as to what things are going to be going forward. But what I can bring insight to, and what we do bring insight to for our clients, is how the situation has evolved, and how does the new environment relate back to the fundamental core value proposition of business aviation. You talked a lot about touch points. Well, even before the pandemic, most business aviation customers want as few touch points as possible. In the perfect world, they want the limo to drive up to the airplane. They want to get out of the car, get on the airplane, the door shuts, and they fly away. So in the pandemic, it hasn't really changed that desire. And that's why business aviation is advantaged over other transportation means, because it has the fewest touch points possible. So in many ways, what we're seeing is business aviation has to reinforce and communicate its advantages that it always had, because that's probably what's going to bring people to the industry and keep them happy and keep them staying using private aviation.
Yeah, exactly. And to communicate in a different way and to a different audience, because the potential audience now, or customer base, is changing all the time.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because one thing that we really see, and I think it's important to hear not so much what the prediction is for business aviation, but to see currently how the use of the tool is changing. So one of the things we hear a lot is that there's a lot of a need for using private aviation for personal use, and the personal use is for hygiene purposes, managing risk, but also people just want to get away and improve their lifestyle, where the inverse is happening on the business side. Business travel is really ground to a halt, due to a lot of reasons. And also there's been tools like, for example, what we're on right now, Zoom, which enable the need to travel for business to diminish. So I think what's going to be very important is to understand what are the motivations to travel in general, and how does the business aviation tool suit those particular types of motivations. So I don't want to predict, because we don't know how things are going to move forward, but certainly how does business aviation speak to people who want to travel for personal means, and for those who need to travel for business needs, how does it convince them that still the personal trip is still essential when we have all these tools that are here available that, for example, that we're using today?
Yeah. No, exactly. And so now you spoke about, how do you help business aviation clients bridge the gaps? How do you help this new awareness? So how would you actually go about now working? If I was an organization, I said, look, my God, we're having a few problems before. The pandemic has changed everything. I've been involved in support flights, private flights, business flights, medical support, everything. But what I want to focus on now is how to change people's perceptions of what they do when they fly, why they should take into account certain elements when they fly, and how we can provide it on the private aviation. So with that in mind, what sort of background or what sort of risk or what sort of, fundamentals would you be working on to make the wheels turn around and for them to see then how their strategy and vision looks like?
Well, I think the key thing is that there's two kind of core elements that we all our research focuses on, and maybe I'll just take a moment to explain how we collect the information. I think it helps explain what we would recommend. So we have the ability to conduct surveys, we have the ability to conduct online focus groups, we have the ability to do one-on-one executive interviews, and we even now, some of the new things we're working on, even to measure people's reaction to advertising through more neuroscience, how people look at things and how they get emotionally excited by them and so forth, which is really exciting. So what our job is to actually take some of the things that people are saying anecdotally and put some rigor to it. And really, there's two questions that you want to answer no matter what the situation is. Why are people using your product? What's motivating them to use it? And what's motivating them not to use it, either for reasons that they don't want to use the sector at all or the product whatsoever, or that they're using your competitors. So I always go to our clients and say, how can we talk to people who are desired users, current users, to understand their motivations? And how do I talk to the people that should be using your product but aren't, who are your objectors? And really, it all starts on that premise. And then from there, we figure out what's the right tools to use, what's the right approach to gather, who do we need to talk to, how many of them we need to talk to, and so forth. So it really kind of boils back to those two things: promoters, people who are enthusiastic, and objectors, and how do we understand those better? And with that information, you can say, well, what do we need to overcome to motivate the objectors to actually reduce or to ignore those objections and focus on the benefits? And with the promoters, what can we talk more about and share those experiences with the objectors?
Yeah, no, totally agree. Now, one of the things, and I was talking to my wife about this, one of the things I was saying is that if we had the chance now to do something, what would we do and why? Okay, so my wife said we should do a once in a lifetime trip. We should do it for longer than we would normally do it, and we should take all the kids with us and grandkids. Okay, so real simple folks. So what we've decided to do is we've started to look at places, what we're going to do, whether we're going to hire a villa or whatever, or hotels or whatever. So we've decided to do that. Now, I think most people, they've had such a shock with regards to what this has meant, and they don't want to be in a situation where they haven't made the most, and I don't want to sound too dark about this, but where they haven't made the most of their time with people they care for, or the valuable time that they've got to do something for themselves. So I think there's going to be such a link up now between, like say, private aviation, more luxurious or off the wall types of holidays, so everything runs smoothly. I think that's definitely going to be a case. But I also think that people are going to say, do you know something? We want to do that once in a life trip, but we want to do it every year. So I think the model is going to change. And
absolutely. And really what the essence is life is about choices of priorities, right? Yeah. So what the pandemic is doing is forcing people to reorient their priorities and to say, well, what is truly important to me and how much risk am I willing to take in order to do it? For example, I'm just saying this anecdotally, but I know friends who say, you know what, I'm going to do that trip, but I always wanted to do, pandemic or not, damn the torpedoes. It's too important. It's our 20th wedding anniversary, whatever. And there's other people say, you know what, There's just no way I want to take that trip and have it cancel on me or end up being in quarantine or having the situation evolve on me while I'm either executing my trip or planning it. So really what that is really boiling down to is that how are people managing their personal priorities? And if you're able to measure that and able to really scientifically understand that, then you're going to have a good feeling about what the likelihood is going forward of segments, right? Because one of the things, particularly in B2B businesses and business aviation and private aviation, is that everyone treats the market kind of homogeneously. And they say, well, everyone's going to behave a certain way. But in reality, people have different priorities, right?
Yep.
And those priorities form segments. And it's our job to figure out what those segments are and give them something that specifically addresses the needs, fears, concerns, and desires of those segments. And I think the one, and I would say that a risk sometimes in business aviation is that people treat the market, people's viewpoints as singular, as opposed to much more nuanced and much more segmented. And it's our job to help figure those segments out and then let our customers decide whether they want to go after those segments or reinforce them or not.
Yeah, no, exactly. And to do that and to quantify it, you have access to a huge amount of data, and you've got analysts, and you also work with Adhoc Research. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
so our data,
name, I think. What a great name.
Well, I mean, we what we've learned is our strength is not so much in the data that we have, because for each customer, we collect unique data that's proprietary to them. Yeah. So it's not like we have a big database of opinions that we draw on and then carve them up for our clients. It's really the reverse. We actually go out and collect data tailored to the needs of our clients. And Adhoc helps us do it, because what Adhoc has is that they're in the survey business. So they've got the ability to interview, via web surveys or telephone surveys, hundreds and hundreds of people. And then, of course, in business aviation, we have the database of who's flying aircraft. Other industries have databases of who the executives are. And we deploy those to get a large enough sample that we can actually statistically say that here's what the preferences are, or here's how the preferences are segmented, or even here's what this profile of customer wants versus that profile of customer. So there have been great partners. Adhoc are wonderful people, and they've been in the business longer than I have. And we work really well together because they've got all the infrastructure to do this scientifically. And then at Seefeld's side, our job is to take that data that they collect and to really put a particular tailored insights, very issue-driven analysis. And when necessary, when we need to talk to people directly ourselves to supplement that, or sometimes we don't even need to do the survey, we've got all those tools at our disposal to be able to answer the questions in the right way, in the right timing, for the right audience at the right price.
No. And a point you made there about having access to experts in certain areas. It's like putting a football team or a hockey team together. You pick people because of their strengths for their positions. You don't pick them and then say, right, you're a great left back or you're a great defender, but now because we're short, we need you to go into attack. Obviously that happens sometimes, but out of preference, you wouldn't. So I think
absolutely.
So I think another area that people are going to start to do, I would hope, is that now that there's so many things that people have to consider moving forward. And obviously the most important ones is, cost, cash flow, margin, sustainability, to get them ready for when things are starting to happen. But they need to start thinking ahead now, what's going to happen when the floodgates open, because I genuinely think it is going to go crazy. As soon as things start to open, everybody is going to start wanting to do what they haven't been able to do. Now, I'm talking about costs and cash flow. Sometimes to be penny wise and pound poor, it doesn't make sense. And to bring a specialist in is so important, but to bring them in at the right time so that they can motivate and create a culture or a team approach to that particular problem is really important, because sometimes you can bring a specialist in at the wrong time, or you bring somebody in who's not going to do the right job, but to do it at the right time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think to be fair, I think an objection that some people have mentioned to us since the pandemic, some clients as well, the situation is too fluid. Let's wait till things settle down, and then we'll go and then we'll go and start to get back engaged with customers. And I think that is On the surface, it seems to intuitively make sense, but I think it's a misread of the opportunity and the risk, because what we do is if we put in place a good system where you're listening to customers, we're gathering the information, and we're doing it in real time, then you're able to not have to be in reactive mode. We're all about being proactive. And I use the analogy of there's two schools of thought in marketing, that what you do during a recession, right? Do you pull back because sales are down, or do you actually invest more in marketing in order to get ahead of things when you come out of the recession? And I think there's without sounding self-serving, because obviously, we want to help clients, but I truly believe that it's a mistake to kind of sit back and wait. If you have the good metrics and the good leading indicators telling you how the ground is shifting earlier than someone else, you have competitive advantage. Yep. And success is not about simply just responding to what customers want. It's about doing it in a way that you do it better and sooner, quicker, and smarter than your competitors. And this is what we sell. We don't just sell aligning to customer needs. We sell aligning with customer needs better than the people who aren't doing that type of analysis and research.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. Same thing with training and competency and stuff. You don't sit back and don't do that because things are bad. But also, letting people see how things are changing and why they're changing is so important. And one of the issues that I've been watching is the way customers, whether it's complaints on TV or on various websites, where they're complaining the fact that they wanted to use a particular carrier, but because of the carrier's policies with cashback or refunds or etc., that weren't very good, they're actually making statements that they will not use them again in the future.
Yeah.
So those that do the right thing at the right time, they can also maintain that customer base, as well as obviously the new opportunities that come.
Well, I think it's really interesting about you mentioned the airline situation and people's and the ability to cancel and flexibility and so forth. I mean, a huge pent up demand is that people wanted the ability to be more flexible in their travel. But as the cost of airline seats came down, what was being given up was the ability to leverage that flexibility. And exactly. What I think what you may suspect is coming out of the pandemic, people's expectation is, because the pandemic situation is so fluid, because new restrictions come in, people want the ability to be able to be more flexible. And I think there's going to be an expectation that they're not prepared to pay for that flexibility at a premium that they did in the past. So, not without being too much of a crystal ball about the predictor of the airline industry, I think the model of what are you prepared to give up to get a lower cost seat may be changing. And in the past, it used to be, well, I gave up flexibility and I gave up service. Yeah. Is that still going to be the case going forward? No. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there's going to be a real big shift. Now, I know we spoke about not looking at the crystal ball and the future, etc., without the right data decision making. But how do you see the needs of your private aviation customers now changing in the post-pandemic world? Because they're going through a purple patch at the moment. I mean, everybody that I know is actually thinking to themselves, if they had the opportunity, they would use private aviation. Now, lots are going to start looking at modified models and, different fractional share and all sorts of products. So how do you see that going?
Well, I think the key is to look at who's using private aviation and what are they using it for. So as opposed to kind of saying, well, here's what the needs are going to be, I think you have to kind of look at saying, well, what's the profiles of people who are going to use it going forward, and what's in their mind objections and opportunities. So for example, if a lot of new people are coming into private aviation because they're concerned about the security and knowing that private aviation is more secure and safe from a health standpoint, well, they come with that. Those are motivators, but they haven't used business aviation until now. So what have been the objections in the past that they've had to overcome in order to get to the point that they're using private aviation? So for example, are they concerned about the image of using a private jet and that it's seen as too ostentatious, but now the health and safety reasons are so strong that's diminished? So I think it's so important to look at who's using it and why, and then you're going to be able to peel back the onion and understand about what the needs are associated with it. So we talked earlier in our conversation about, there may be more use for private aviation for personal trips of more of a shorter and domestic nature. Well, that generates a whole bunch of needs, which are completely different than people who are using business aviation to get point to point around the world. And so I would always kind of, as I've said so far along, to avoid the crystal ball about what overall people want, and look at more about how is the industry going to be constructed and where are the trips going to come from going forward.
Yep.
One thing which we haven't talked about, which I do talk about, and I think the pandemic is going to drive that home even more, is that in business aviation and private aviation, you're seeing a generational shift, both in terms of the providers themselves, how the age group and the age cohort who are now making the decisions on the client side, but also the age and the people who are using it are becoming increasingly younger and from different generations. They have different expectations about environmental sustainability.
Yep.
They have different expectations about how transactions and business takes place. They very much want an electronic-based transaction versus the older generation who are much more comfortable dealing with kind of individuals, brokers, talking to them on the phone. Nowadays, that's seen as, to a certain generation, that's seen as very passé and slow and inefficient. And how is business aviation going to address not just the pandemic issues, but the whole new generation of clients that it's going to have to serve?
Yeah, no, 100%. And the change as well, like you said, in the age groups, but something that you said there as well is about the shall we say, the public perception, because sometimes, and it seems a little bit, it's almost a paradox in itself, where people almost condemn people for being successful. And like my grandfather said, I've never seen a poor man give another man a job. And,
yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Or as my dad said, I've been rich and I've been poor, and rich is better.
Yeah, no, exactly. But but the whole point about people, they shouldn't be ashamed of success. And interestingly enough, we had a podcast with Steve Fasano, and he actually said that. He said, "Why should people be ashamed of success?" He said, "Because the more successful we are, the more it has a positive impact on others." Now, you also mentioned about climate issues and carbon footprint and sustainability, but at the end of the day, that also refers to planet, people, and profit. And in many cases, the profitability, because it's a lot more expensive to be focusing on the greener aspects, and people's understanding, and you can't just focus on the planet. Yeah. So you can't do one without all three being considered. And from what I've done, and I'm no expert at all, but within the private aviation sector, the actual carbon footprint issues are being addressed very, very seriously and very, very positively, which is great.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things to track over time, it's a great example about, historically, green issues haven't been very important in the private aviation world, because people kind of accepted to say, well, it's not the greenest thing to do, but the benefits of the tool, using the tool, outweigh it. But, getting ahead of things is measuring, is that assumption changing over time? It doesn't change like that overnight, but gradually, perhaps the issue of sustainability is becoming more important. And one of the things which is really interesting, and we do here in general, is that, it's one thing to say I'm using a private jet to address a particular need. It's something very different to say I own one. Yeah. And the concept of ownership and the appeal of ownership is changing versus the experience of using a private jet as a tool for particular uses. And I don't think the jury's out yet about how that relationship has evolved. But I think one would say that if you view the lens purely through only ownership, but not think about people who may want to experience private aviation and may view it differently than owning an aircraft themselves. Both have tremendous advantages. Both are legitimate ways of traveling. But I think it's going to be important on the industry to understand how the perception of the two may be different going forward.
Yeah, no, that's very valid. And also, you just made me think of something there as well now, because you were talking about not looking forward and not having the crystal ball, but having, data-driven decision-making criteria. Now, everything is fluid at the moment. And one of the things that's topical here at the moment now is on the news, they're talking about anybody coming in has to be put in a hotel, etc., etc. And of course, everybody else said, well, that's not new. So why are they only doing it now? Why weren't they doing it back when they could have controlled the, the numbers of people getting ill and dying, etc.? So there's going to be a huge biopsy on all of the things that have gone wrong and why and how. But moving forward in this very fluid situation, how often do you think those customer surveys or the research with the executives and the interviews, etc., how often do you think they have to be done to make sure that it's carrying on, taking things forward, and not just a one-off, and then you have to learn again and you do another one?
It's a very good question, and it's one that there's no kind of easy answer to. I would think, and a lot of it relates to, well, what business am I in? How much do I have to monitor incremental changes versus just going in and tracking more fundamental changes over time? I mean, I certainly would say if you're doing the same survey, 6 months from now, and it depends on what you're measuring, then probably that's overkill. And we're not in the business of getting people to gather information that they don't need or to recollect the same information twice. And we talked about that, before the interview started, about how there's inefficiency collecting the same information again and again and again. But I do think if you take the approach that I'm only going to do something when I know something, I'm only going to measure when I think something's changed, that's a risk too. So I think what we always advise our clients is to say is, how much precision do you need in the short run, particularly when it comes to things like brand reputation? Some companies' brand reputation is really important, and even subtle changes are very important. Others, you can afford to say, well, we're the pioneer, we're the leader, we can allow a little bit more time to pass. So, but what I would say is, if you say, I'm only going to measure when something's changed or when we're doing something to change it, that's probably too long. But if you say, well, I need to wake up every morning and have a new measure of how my brand is doing, well, that's probably overkill. And there's ways that you can actually get the right balance in terms of doing a proper survey every year or so or more, with having check-ins or having, if you will, leading indicators that you can look into and check to make sure to signal that nothing's going astray. So this is part of the kind of tailored approach that we work with our clients to come up with what's the right frequency and tools we use so that it matches their information needs, their budgets, and who they're serving. Because within business aviation or B2B industries or aviation in general, everyone's depending on what you sell, the market may be very dynamic. If you're selling a service that's evolving very quickly, that's one thing. If you're selling a very stable product in another part of the supply chain, you may not need it as often.
Yeah. No, that's why everybody's different. And you mentioned that Jane Stanbury also works with you. We've had Jane on the podcast, and some of the things that Jane comes up with as well, it really makes you think. And this concept that you're dealing with has made me think about some of the situations that I've been in my career, and the types of people that have been in the same room when we're talking about some of these particular issues. Now, some characters and some outlooks can really influence that senior level as to whether or not to make the right decision or an indifferent decision, or a lukewarm decision, or and it's also how involved they want to become with this particular marketing approach. What have you seen as the best combination of success? I'm hoping that it would be the more cynical groups, because they can then see a big difference. But what types of groups have you had the most success with?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to add a little preface to it and say that one of the most fun parts of what we do is collecting the data, analyzing, providing the insights. But when you walk in the room and you facilitate the output of it, and kind of reveal the truth about what the customers think, every client behaves differently and reacts differently to it. And that's really a function of the dynamics of the people in the room, the corporate culture that's there, their situation as to, whether it's a crisis or they're being proactive. And so this is the part that I love and I can't do it now physically because I can't walk through the door of the client, but the reaction to the information and how the team itself plays it and responds to it amongst themselves is one of the most intriguing, interesting, revealing aspects of what I do, and one of the aspects of the job I most enjoy. So I say that, given what you said earlier about how do you navigate situations where there's the loudest voice in the room, there's the people who have a certain resistance to want to speak the voice of the customer because they're worried about how it's going to play out and the political dynamics of the room and so forth. And our job is really to cut through all that, is to kind of go there and say, well, this is what the blood test reveals, right? I mean, this is the diagnosis. It's arguable in the sense about what to do about it, but it's unarguable about what actually the feedback from the customer is saying. And I think a mistake that some businesses do, and I really hope that doesn't happen, is that they kind of use it as a hammer to kind of beat up someone else in the organization, point fingers at someone. This is not the use of the proper use of the information, and it's really doing it to disservice. What we're really trying to do is to give everyone a common understanding about what's going on, and then with that clarity and with the insights that we derive from it, kind of help steer people towards options to be able to address the issues or take advantage of it. So it's really not at all a threat to kind of say, well, your division's not doing as well because their customers are more unhappy than this division's. And this is a completely wrong use of the information. What's much more useful is to say, well, here are the reasons why customers think the way they do, and here are the roadblocks that we're discovering. And with discovering the roadblocks, here's the path to actually address them and address them successfully. So it's a very positive thing as opposed to a threatening thing. And I have to say, my business, one of the things that hurts business going forward is when if the survey creates a toxic culture, that's really bad. When it's completely not the reason at all, it's to actually facilitate everyone coming together to come up with a solution together. And it makes the most sense that employees and management can buy into.
Yeah, no, 100%. If they all care, then it should come out. But there's an interesting point. I might ask you how you would deal with, with a group that were, we've got enough experience, we've been doing this for long enough, we've got a big market share, we don't need to do anything else.
Well, I think my answer to them is to say, well, it's what's worked in the past may not necessarily work in the future. And if you had the opportunity to know what your future is going to look like earlier than waiting for it to come, wouldn't you want to take advantage of it? I mean, if the world is full of, the graveyard is full of people who made false assumptions or expected the world to continue the way it would tomorrow, the way it did today, and that our ability to succeed in the past is going to guarantee our success in the future. I mean, the business graveyard is full of people who thought like that. And our job is not to question your decision making or to undermine your expertise, but it's to give you the tools to take your success and build on it. It's a tool. It's a building on tool, not a new regime tool. It's giving you. Why wouldn't you take advantage of information that you can have that give you a leapfrog over your competitors? Why wouldn't you want that?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I'm just thinking, I've had a problem in the house with a leak, a bit of a plumbing issue. So obviously, because it is now, you try and fix it yourself. But it comes to a point where you think, my God, why did I not just get a good plumber to come in?
Yes. Yes, and I'm no plumber, and I'm a terrible DIY, what do they call it, do-it-yourself guy. I'm a disaster at that. I'm a firm believer, get the guy who knows what he's doing in to fix it.
And there's no better way to end the podcast than to leave it with those words. Get the best person who knows what they're doing to come in and help. This has been an absolute pleasure. It's been great to listen and also to learn. And I firmly believe that, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing something, who you are, what your experiences are. There's no real experts now left because this is a brand new world we're entering, all of us. And, it's important then to do it in the right way moving forward with the customer at the forefront, and to listen to the customer and understand the risks of losing a customer are so important. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's been a real pleasure, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. And you've posed some great questions and really made me think about why what we do is important. So it's been a real pleasure. Thanks again.
And it's our pleasure. Really glad you joined us. Thanks very much, Charles. And please say hello to Jane as well.
Will do. Will do.
Thank you. Cheers.